Alright, this is going to be another video addressing CLA 47. Again, apologize if I'm not saying that correct. I got a chance to watch your response to me, some back and forth on the comments. It's one of those things with comments where it becomes pretty clear that there's more to be discussed than is going to really fit very well into that comment section. I'm sure you will notice that as well, so I toned it down after I realized why I was going to make a response. And so you brought up a lot of points, and many of them are not directly related to healthcare, although all of them have ancillary tangential sorry, uh, relations, and most of them are things that require big videos in and of themselves. I think all of them I've made videos to in the past. And of course, I can't chide you for not having watched all my videos. I see you just recently subscribed, and I know I have way too many videos to watch, but I'm not going to go into depth on those ancillary issues, and I want to focus not even on just healthcare generally, because that's a huge issue, but just about some of your argumentation that you used in favor of the NHS. And this is not going to be a definitive refutation of national healthcare, government healthcare, just some of the arguments that you're putting forward in favor of it that are not convincing. Now, I think there are other arguments for national healthcare that are better, but I'm not hearing them from you. Right off the bat, I'm going to real quickly address one or two other things that I think not directly related. First, you raised questions about monopoly. Basically, the argument is that we need government regulation to prevent monopolies or cartels from forming, and that there's no guarantee in a free market that monopolies won't form. And in in the physical sense of like the laws of physics, don't deny that. But this would be like saying, and not even, this is not hyperbole, if I were to say we need to have government regulation of religion, because if we don't, one person could become a cult leader of everybody, or at the very least of so many people that they could control the entire society. And there's no physical thing that prevents that from happening. And so it makes sense to have the government regulate, control, or in some way prevent that, because if we don't, then it could hypothetically happen. Now, that's logical in the strict sense, but it's totally unreasonable. And the reason is it's very, very, very unlikely that any one person could ever be that persuasive, that powerful, that they could convert everyone from all religions to their cult in their lifetime. And you could say, oh, well, Jesus did that. No, Jesus only converted a few people, and then he died. And it took hundreds of years before Christianity became the dominant religion anywhere. I mean, maybe it was popular within a generation or two in Palestine, but one person's never going to do that. And the other thing is open question. If people actually believe in somebody as the Messiah or whatever, it's debatable that they should be prevented from doing so because people are choosing. Now, monopoly is similar. There is no law of physics that makes it impossible, but historically speaking, every monopoly that has ever existed, or oligopoly or cartel, has done so usually, almost always, explicitly from government subsidy, and when not explicitly, implicitly or tangentially. There are no free market monopolies that have ever happened, and people have tried. There's been plenty of people over the years who wanted to become the only provider, or who colluded with other providers, and it doesn't work. A good example here would be within the railroad industry. Providers would get together, and you'd have various different railroads, and they all have different levels of infrastructure, different levels of efficiency, and they'd say, look, we're in a war, a price war, where we're cutting rates all the time to try and get volume from each other. And it's hard. The competition's hard, and really, at any given point, only a small percentage of the rail lines were really successful, and most of them were always struggling because of this. Now, in the meantime, consumers were getting lower and lower rates. Freight rates just were constantly declining during the late 19th century because of these wars. And so they'd get together and they'd say, let's form a cartel. Let's all agree and make all of our rates equal. Let's make it a rate so that we all can make a nice profit margin. And there we have it. Consumers will pay more, but we'll all profit because of it. Well, it doesn't work, because within that scenario, the more efficient members of the collusion, since they are more efficient, if they were to lower their rates, the increased volume they would get. So let's say the cartel gets together and they say, let's charge $8 a ton for freightage, per $8 per 100 miles per ton. The most efficient carriers, which there will be more or less efficient ones within the cartel, are going to say, well, if we lowered our price to say $8 per ton per 100 miles, our volume would increase not just that percentage, but much more, and we'll get a higher slice of the pie. We'll become much wealthier. And so they have every incentive to cheat, and they always did. And as soon as they start doing that, the other cartel members realize, okay, well, we can't just keep charging as a partial cartel higher rates, because then they're just going to expand like crazy. So we have to cut as well. That's what happens every time, except when they make it illegal, where the government comes and says you have to be a monopoly. And governments do this all the time. Every monopoly that you can name, and there's many explicit ones, like the government comes and says you have to form a cartel. That's what in the New Deal, that was the main part of the New Deal, was to cartelize industry and say no one else can compete, and we're setting wage and price controls. So it's ahistoric to talk about free market monopolies, and I can come to some of you that are quibbles about free markets generally, but there's that problem. There's also problems with the larger firms become, especially if they integrate vertically and horizontally, they become less and less efficient. I know there's a big tendency to think of economies of scale, and that the bigger you are, the more profitable you become, but that's actually not true. As you become, as more layers of the production process become integrated within one system, they can't rationally allocate resources well, because they don't see prices. If you own the coal mine and the steel mill and the steel mine, the iron ore mine, because you don't mine steel, and the car factory, then it becomes much harder to calculate if you're losing money vis-a-vis if you were just buying those raw materials. And this is actually an outgrowth of what's known as the socialist economic calculation problem. If you don't have exchange in goods, then you can't really rationally allocate. So the bigger a business becomes, the less wieldy it becomes. And that's why big corporations often end up breaking up into little pieces. I used to own stock in PepsiCo, and they owned a whole slew of restaurants. They were one of the biggest restaurant companies in the whole country. They owned Taco Bell, Pizza Hut, and KFC, just to name some. And they broke that off into a new company called Tricon. And they didn't do it because they love the little guy and they love competition and they're socialists. They did it because they couldn't manage all those balls. And they realized they were hemorrhaging money because they were trying to do more things than they could. And so investors within the major corporation thought that they could make more money as an independent, not even a subsidiary, independent company, and so they did. It made enough sense that they were able to agree to that. So it's literally never happened. So I don't think you can take that for granted. People have tried it, and it just doesn't work. Another problem that you brought up is the issue of, and this is a potentially valid criticism, because let me just read this. This is a comment you made in your video to one of the comments I made. A free market existed in the healthcare industry. In this industry, one that did not suffer government interference or intervention, the free market failed to provide adequate healthcare for the poor. Also, the non-existence of a true free market has not been okay, I'm going to skip that. It has simply been my acknowledgement of the common libertarian claim that a true free market system, one that does not suffer any kind of government interference in any kind of industry, has never existed. Those are mutually exclusive claims. You can't say that there was a free market in healthcare and then define a free market as something where there is no government intervention in any industry. If that's the definition of a free market, then there was not a free market in the UK, and hence it can't be blamed for the lack of coverage for the poor because there wasn't a free market. Now, it could be argued, I mean, and earlier said there's never been a free market, it doesn't exist, it never has existed, and that's true. There's never been a society anywhere that was completely meeting the ideal of free market advocates like me, or like anyone else for that matter. And this is what really bothers me with this argument, because you say, because I'm an anarcho-capitalist. I don't think there should be any government, any state. I think there should be free market capitalism. That should be how every part of aspect of society is run, where people are interacting with each other. All interactions should be voluntary. There should be no taxation, no eminent domain, none of that stuff. That is never going to happen because you have even one crime committed in a society, one robbery, one rape, one murder, then that society has coercion in it, has violence, and it's not a pure free market. That doesn't mean that it's not a good idea to reach for. The other thing is, it's not an argument because no perfect idealized socialist system has ever existed. Maybe you consider yourself a socialist, maybe you like certain aspects of this or that socialist government, but I'm willing to comfortably assume that you don't think that, say, in the UK, the system is perfect. Is the UK system perfect? Are there things that you would want to see tweaked? I'm going to guess the answer is yes. And that if I asked any socialist in the UK or any other person in the UK, is the UK system perfect? The answer is going to be no. And if it's not no, then that person probably has extreme conservative bias, meaning that whatever exists, they just accept it. And not only that, if I were to ask you, so what system in the world today is perfect? Is the Swedish system perfect socialism? Is that exactly what you think is the best method for society to run what they have in Sweden? I doubt you're going to say yes. You might say that's the closest that I can point to, but you're not going to say the Swedish system is perfect. What about Norway or Iceland or Germany? Or, I remember someone asked Noam Chomsky, and he said, well, that stuff that kind of happens in Bolivia, something like that, which is to imply not exactly that. And, a lot of anarcho-syndicalists will say, well, anarcho-syndicalist Spain. And then you say, well, what about all these problems and that they were bloodthirsty and blah, 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 and they weren't really anarcho-syndicalist? Like, okay, yeah, it was down that spectrum. So the idealized system that any given person has as their as what they want has never existed. And it's not just socialism, and it's not just free markets. It's capitalism. It's mixed economies. It's monarchy. No monarchy has been perfect monarchy. Even when you had rulers who asserted themselves to be, absolute monarchs, and even when you had advocates of absolute monarchy, the advocates of absolute monarchy were never satisfied with the degree of control that the monarchs had. They always thought, there's some institutions in society that are thwarting the degree of power we think the monarch should have. Whether this is Tsarist Russia or Bourbon France, there were always people not satisfied. And so it's a totally invalid argument to say, look, the free markets never existed, so it's not possible. And to your credit, you say that's not one of your major arguments, but I think it's a totally invalid one. Unless you're going to tell me that there is a perfect system in operation now, or that has been in the past, that you think is perfect, as good as humanly possible. Let's not say utopian, but as good as humanly possible. And then if so, I'd like to hear about it. But I doubt it, because as soon as you say, okay, Sweden circa 1980, then you're open the door for all types of criticism. And so I don't buy that. Now, I think it's true that then you could allege, okay, well, libertarians always have this out where they can say, they can blame the lack of the free market on all problems, so, and I am going to say this later, so I'm anticipating a possible argument here, but you could say, okay, libertarians are just going to say there isn't a free market, and so they're going to dogmatically blame the lack of a free market on, say, whatever social ills we're talking about. And this argument, though, is equally applicable to statists, because socialists are always bitching that there isn't enough government. Government's growing all the time. It's getting bigger all the time. It's taxing more. It's spending more. It's inflating more. It's regulating more. But socialists are always saying, well, the problem we have is the free market. People still assert that we have a free market in the United States, even though these are sometimes people who laud the abolition of the free market, say during the Progressive era or the New Deal. It's really interesting, where it's similar to the fallacy you had there, where you said free markets have never existed, one sentence after you said that free markets were not providing healthcare for the poor. Well, I thought they didn't exist. I mean, so what we have to realize is that historically, there has been, every society has been a mixture of the two. But the mixture hasn't been even in every society. There are free market, and a good place to look here is a book called The State by Franz Oppenheimer. And he divided human transactions into two types: the economic means and the political means. And basically he said if two people agree to an exchange, whether that's based on a monetary transaction, whether that's based on barter, whether that's based on charity, whether it's based on some other kind of voluntary exchange, that's the economic means. The political means is one party agrees to the exchange and the other does not. So stealing, theft, taxation, that sort of thing. Every society that's ever existed has had both. No question about it. But that means we have to be refined in our critiques of any given society and try and isolate, well, what element in the society is the cause of the problem. So we can look at, say, just pre-NHS, Clement Atlee becomes Prime Minister, and look at that in the UK society. There's definitely market phenomenon in the UK at that time. Definitely. I mean, the UK was one of the most free market societies ever in the late 19th century. Wasn't perfectly free market, but it had a lot of free market stuff in it, and it still had a decent amount of free market stuff when Clement Atlee became president, or Prime Minister, excuse me. But it also had a lot of government interference going on as well. And so if we're going to start pointing fingers at the causes of social problems, we have to analyze it more. It's not enough to say free market is present or market activity is present, or on my end, it's not enough to say, well, there's government present, so hence government's the problem. And if we look around the world, even the extreme examples like North Korea or the USSR, they had market activities going in them. Less, and I know he doesn't really make many YouTube videos about this, and I wish he would, because he's very well read and he's a brilliant guy. YouTube user named Anton Beatty. I think he's a public school teacher in Detroit, actually, at least a teacher in Detroit. We've never had a perfectly free market, but he goes, let's compare societies that have striven into opposite directions in this regard. So societies that have attempted, albeit imperfectly, to implement socialism. The USSR, North Korea, Communist China, East Germany, and other societies that have embraced market phenomenon to a greater degree. The United States, the UK, West Germany, Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, and compare them. And it's kind of a shit game to compare different societies over different times and different periods. I mean, what does Australia and Poland really have in common? Not very much. In the two best test case examples, we have North and South Korea and East and West Germany. These are places that were unified culturally, unified in terms of their degree of education, literacy, relatively similar in the types of resources available to them. In the case of North Korea, actually has more natural resources than South Korea and a higher population, so that would be hypothetically a better off society. East Germany was smaller than West Germany, but it had, it's more than its fair share of the industry and whatnot. But when you compare the two, yes, it was imperfect socialism in North Korea and imperfect socialism in East Germany, and it was certainly imperfect free markets in West Germany and South Korea. But there's absolutely no comparison between the two countries. I mean, just none. It's sheer delusion to think that they was even remote, or the United States and the Soviet Union. I have a great friend who grew up in the Soviet Union, YouTube user, legal immigrant, who has a terrible YouTube username but is a great user. And he did a video juxtaposing basically the standard of living in the Soviet Union, and it doesn't compare with the living in the United States, even if we say take the living in the USSR in the 1980s and compare it to standard of living in the United States in the 1950s. It doesn't compare. It's way below. And USSR, huge population of intelligent people. People in the USSR usually score pretty high on IQ tests. Just a second.